Hey everyone, it's Brittany here with our latest episode of Stories of the Bible. If you've been watching, I thank you and thanks for waiting for this newest episode. If you have not been watching, you don't have to go back to the beginning, but I do recommend it just so you can see the story of the Bible from the very beginning. I do these videos because I realize not everyone was exposed to the stories of the Bible as children. I myself was only exposed to a few stories of the Bible. So I think for those who didn't grow up in the church, either who are new believers or those who just never really had much experience in church, I think that we take it for granted that they know and understand the stories of the Bible. And I've realized as I've grown older that that's not exactly the case. So I have put together these videos so others can know the stories of the Bible, um, even if they haven't necessarily grown up in the church. So yeah, that's where we are. As always, I do paraphrase these stories. I have read them, and I encourage you, please read them on your own. As much as I've studied, there is always something else that you can glean from it. The Bible is called the Living Word for a reason, and it's because we each are to read it on our own and study it, and God speaks to us through His Word. Yes, He can speak to you through others like me. However, He wants to talk to you too, so read it for yourself. If I read any portion of scripture, which I don't think I'm going to today because it is a very long episode already, but if I do, I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. If you want to read the same version, go for it. If you have your own that you prefer, by all means, read it. Just read the word. So today we're going to be talking about Abram. Now, over the course of the last couple of episodes, we talked about Noah and how God destroyed the earth through the flood and only saved a few people. Then we see that Noah and his family land back on land and they start populating the earth. Then we see in the Tower of Babel that all of the people were really living in one place. I mean, they all came from the same ancestors, so they were living in one place. And they started building their technology. They started building this tower that would put them touching the heavens. And as somebody pointed out in the comments on my last video, it was like they were trying to make themselves equal with God. And God saw this and decided, you know what? I still want them creating, but they're too powerful as they are, so we're going to give them different languages, we're going to confuse them, and we're going to send them out. And that brings us to where we are today with Abram's story. So, Abram, his ancestors were the children of Noah. He ended up in one area, while others, his very, very, very distant cousins, ended up in a place called Canaan. They were the Canaanites. They were descended from Canaan. And there was Egypt. So I'm not going to try to do geography, because if you know anything about me, you'll know that I am horrible at geography in all ways. So if you want to look up the maps and such for yourself, you can, but I'm not going to try to do that for you. So anyway, back to our story. Abram was the son of Terah. And if you're trying to figure out where we are in the Bible, we are looking at Genesis chapter 11, and we're in verses 27 through 12, verse 9, for this first section of the story. And as you read it, you'll start to see Terah was a man who felt the need to leave his homeland and go towards Canaan. And as he's traveling, he takes his entire family with him. And this includes Abram and it's Abram's nephew, Lot, or Lot. It's pronounced differently depending on who you're listening to. We're going to call him Lot for the purposes here. So anyway, they're all traveling together. And the relationship between Abram and Lot becomes important later in the story. We're not going to get there today, but that's why I'm mentioning him now, specifically by name. So anyway, Terah brings his family They're going towards the land of Canaan, but they don't make it. Instead, Terah settles his family in a town called Haran. And they continue living life. Terah ends up passing at the age of 205 years old, and they've got this entire settlement now, right? Then God comes to Abram and speaks to him and tells him, "You are to leave your father's household." Now, this is highly, highly unusual. The people back then did not leave their father's household. Now, if the entire family moved, that was one thing. But you stayed with your ancestors, you stayed with your family. But God came to Abram and said, "You are going to leave your father's household, and you are going to travel to the land of Canaan, which I am going to promise to your family." And rather than arguing or saying, "But it's not done, God," Abram does. He takes his barren wife. If you're not sure what that means, it means his wife Sarai could not have children. He takes his wife, he takes his nephew Lot, and others. If you read the Bible, it tells you exactly who. But he takes others with him, and they go towards the land of Canaan. He is following God's call. Then we get to chapter 12, verse 10. And I always enjoy this story, and yet I find it a little weird. We go from verses 10 through 20 with this story. Abram ends up in Egypt, and he and his wife Sarai are actually extremely closely related. And back then, that's what they did. It later becomes different. God tells them not to marry their sisters, their cousins. Yeah, but back at this point in time, close relatives would intermarry. There weren't that many people. So, yeah, to get that out of the way, because Abram, before they enter Egypt, looks at his wife and tells her, and again, I'm paraphrasing, "You are a beautiful woman. They're going to want you. We need to lie and tell them that you're my sister." Which technically wasn't necessarily a huge lie, but she was also his wife. So he didn't want them to know that Sarai was his wife, because in his words, "They'll kill me if they know you're my wife, so tell them you're my sister." So that's what they did. They enter Egypt. They tell everyone that Sarai is actually his sister and not his wife. Pharaoh comes, gives Abram a bunch of gifts, and takes Sarai for his own. Because of this, because Sarai is a married woman, God sends a plague against Pharaoh and his family. Pharaoh, understandably, is upset, and he comes to Abram and says, "What have you done to me? You told me she was your sister. This never would have happened had you been honest with me. Now get out of Egypt." And he sends an armed guard to escort Abram, Sarai, and all of the people out of Egypt, and they're ousted. They are sent away, and there is no longer a plague among the Egyptians. So yeah, that was. I always enjoy that story, and yet I always wonder, would the Egyptians have actually killed Abram? And we don't know. So I thought you might enjoy that part of the story. But we are going to continue on, and we're looking at chapters 15 and 16 as well. And I think this is a really important part of the story. Well, it all kind of is. But we look at this, we know that Abram has already trusted God once. He left his father's household, something that isn't done. And he goes out and goes to Egypt and is going towards the land of Canaan. And then God comes to him again in chapter 15. And he says to him, "Abram, this land that you're standing in, the land of the Canaanites, is going to be your inheritance. Your children's children will be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. But when that time is over, your descendants will live in this promised land. This is a promise between me and you." And he has Abram sacrifice animals, and then God passes between it as a flame, sealing this promise. Now, if you remember, Abram's wife was barren. She could not have children. Instead of trusting God at his word that he will have many descendants through his wife, which would be the assumption, right? He and Sarai are old. Abram is 86 years old. And he and his wife realize, she is past childbearing years. So Sarai tells him instead, take my Egyptian slave, Hagar, have relations with her, and you'll have children. And rather than trusting God at his word, Abram does it. Abram sleeps with Hagar, and Hagar ends up having a child that they name Ishmael. And there's a lot more to that story we're going to tell later, but suffice it to say that Hagar ends up looking down upon Sarai because she was able to have a child while Sarai was not. Now, we're going to pause the story here today. I just threw a lot of information at you. I threw a lot of different things at you. And we're going to continue Abram's story next time. We're also going to hit on Lot. We have a lot going on. But I wanted to pause us here because I think that we all have these stages in our lives where we have listened to God's call before. Even when others might have looked at us and told us that we were crazy for listening. And we move. And then we get to a point where it feels like God has promised us something, but we're so afraid of missing it, or that we don't have the right pieces together for it, or whatever. There is always something that makes us doubt God's word in our lives. And like Abram, maybe we don't go and sleep with someone else or have a child with someone else. Maybe I don't even know. Maybe we start dating someone that we shouldn't be dating, someone that we know isn't right for us, but because we know we're supposed to be married someday, we start dating someone in the hopes that even though things aren't right, maybe it'll work out. Or maybe you know that you are supposed to go to school, and so you start applying to all these different places. And rather than waiting for God's timing, you take the first thing that pops up. Or maybe, but I don't know. I'm not going to keep naming things. I know that for me, I knew I was being called into full-time ministry. And so I quit my teaching job. And I am kind of glad I did because it opened a lot of doors that I wouldn't have been able to go through that early in my journey. But at the same time, I could have avoided a lot of hurt and heartache and conflict had I just waited for God. And then again, I started knowing that I was being called back to school, and I immediately started applying places. I didn't really look that deeply into the programs. I knew I wanted to go to school for publishing, and I assumed that meant, because one school required it, I assumed it meant that I had to go back to undergrad and take a lot of classes. And then I realized, after looking more deeply, that number one, the programs I was applying to weren't great. Number two, the better master's programs out there didn't actually require those courses. And so I stopped. I sat back and I gave God back the reins and said, you know what, God? Not my will, your will be done. And he brought me here to Emerson in Boston. And so, as much as I wanted to make things happen on my own, I would have wasted a whole lot of money had I not listened for God's exact call. And I think we all fall into that. And we're going to see it repeated partially in Abram's life. And not necessarily that he didn't listen to God, but more that he was actively seeking God's voice at all times. And I want you to think about that as we go through the rest of this portion of the Bible. What is God calling you to? And are you waiting for his timing, or are you trying to make things happen on your own? Because God will fulfill his promises. If he promised it to you, he is good and faithful and will see you through it. So that is what we have today for the stories of the Bible. As always, please, please, please read through these words on your own. You never know what God's going to speak to you through his word. So I will see you next time for another episode of Stories of the Bible. Read on, and I will see you soon. Hey everyone, it is Brittany here, and I just wanted to say make sure you subscribe here on YouTube so you can see all of my new videos and watch all the old ones. I hope that these stories are helping you learn, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks!